Greetings, YouTube. As I mentioned in my last video, I recently was looking at the game Symbaroum or whatever. It's Symbaroum, however you say it. And their use of corruption as a counterbalance to spellcasting. Um, and one of the nations they have in there, one of the human nations, there are essentially two human cultures. One which is a uh, monarchy called the Ambrians, which is, very uh, European vibe going on there. Uh, and all arcane magic is outlawed, but the divine magic being practiced by the Church of Prios is authorized and allowable, even though the spells are, almost identical. The source of their power is exactly the same. It's just that the church is convinced the people that their version of those spells are better than the ones being cast by witches or by sorcerers or by wizards, even though they aren't any different. And there's no greater or lesser risk of corruption for anybody involved in any of these organizations. But the church has gotten its control of this European monarchy, and they're not letting go. And they have witch hunters. I hate witch hunters. I really do. Again, it's a reinforcement of social conservatism based on the real world. And why do you want to do that in a game of escapism? I can't get that. I don't understand why you want to do that. Now, I could very well see using the nation of Ambria in a campaign, but they're going to be the bad guys. Period. They're not neutral. They're not just another player on the field. They're the bad guys. They're hunting people for who they are inherently, magic users. Just like in our world, there are folks that will hunt others for their inherent traits because they're bigots. There's no difference in my mind. And I can't see bigots in a positive light. I can't see witch hunters in a positive light. Just can't do it. Um, but if I step back for a moment and I look at a nation, in this case Ambria, that's isolated itself politically and uh, structurally from the rest of the nations that have accepted to some degree or others that the arcane uh, spellcasters are useful and are viable, and they're being used in different ways by different peoples. And also, it's a world where humans have multiple cultures, but all the other species, yeah, they have monocultures. Yeah, that's a trope that we've gotten in our RPG games for like 50 years. It's boring. Okay, folks, can we do better? But I don't see how an isolationist entity like Ambria survives in a world where there's other forms of magic. I I can't see how you do that. If other nations are willing to use arcane and divine magic, or arcane, divine, and psionics, or arcane, divine, psionics, and magitech, if they're willing to use all those different varieties, and your nation is only willing to use divine power or actual divine power from a monolithic church or pantheon, the only allowed pantheon, say, um, you're going to lose. Even if you're the biggest nation on the planet, over time, you will lose. You don't have the versatility as the other nations. You don't have the flexibility. You don't have the longevity. You can't be as nimble to respond to different situations because you've got one tool in the shed. It's a hammer. And everything in the world to you is a nail. Newsflash. A good toolbox has more than a hammer in it. I know. I have toolboxes right here next to me. And there are many tools in there, though one drawer is full of hammers. Um, so I, I've never seen how that could function in the real world. how you get away with that? Oh, I should say real world, but how in a fantasy setting? How do you get away with that? You have to you have to stretch the narrative, the rules of narrative armor to the breaking point. Just because an author or a game master or a world builder wants that strife to exist, and they're willing to ignore the fact that over time that monolithic structure that is only allowing one type of magic is going to lose out in a world where everybody else is using everything they can lay their hands on. I mean, you could go completely isolationist. That's, I guess, one model to help keep yourself going as long as possible, and then only deal with on a purely mundane level in trade. But even then, that's going to be difficult because a lot of the trade goods that you would another country can bring in and export will be either directly or indirectly related to spellcasting traditions that you say are no good, that are illegal, items produced by them or items used in the application of those abilities in other countries. Alchemical components, which you're probably not going to want in your nation because that's one step away from spell casting if it isn't actually components for spell casting. There's a lot of overlap between spell components and alchemical concoctions. um, and there's a lot of overlap between like pretty gems and psionic crystals that allow you to store psionic points or let you focus a psionic ability. There's overlap there. And so you're going to have to be able to have much more strict controls of what goes into and out of your nation than other countries whose economies will be much more fluid, much more dynamic, much more flexible, able to take advantage of the world's economic structures far more, rapidly than you can. You are isolating yourself in every conceivable way, and the best you can do is hope for absolute stagnation and that everyone will leave you alone. And if you've got a resource they want, that isn't going to happen. Someone is eventually going to decide that they want what you got. And if the only tools you have at your disposal are from one tradition, and the people who become aggressive towards you have 4 or 5 traditions to really, fall back on, you're in trouble. If the equivalent would be if your nation is only using muskets and you're facing folks who have, you know, cartridge firearms and Gatling guns and mortars and shells, artillery with shells, you're going to lose. Sure, you might put up a good fight. You've gotten really good at using those things, but in the end, you will be defeated. And there's no way getting around that fact. We've seen this in the real world. Because if your folks capture the superior technology of the enemy, you can't use it because you've outlawed it from your people's access. So yeah, having that kind of anti-arcane magic, that whole witch hunter vibe, to me is political suicide. It just doesn't make any sense. And I think that any form of government in a country that has finds itself shackled with an organization, whatever tradition it is that's trying to become the monopoly power in that nation, is going to probably eventually figure that out. And then they're going to actively try to undermine that organization. Maybe very subtly, maybe more overtly, and maybe they're going to try to set them up for a fall. Show the people of their nation how these folks who have professed for centuries of being the only one true church or one true guild or what have you to keep you safe and such, and they have failed miserably, and then that allows an influx of new ideas and thoughts, which eventually put you on par with all the other nations, and you prosper because now you're dealing on an equal footing with everybody else. Though it will probably take you decades to catch up. But in the process, the overall quality of life for your people is going to go up. Um, Now, there is something to be said if you have, for example, a zone in your world which their magic doesn't work. Pathfinder First Edition had that in the Galarian setting. I don't know if that is still true in the second edition of Pathfinder, but there was a magic-free country which his name escapes me at the moment, which is where firearms were developed, and that's where we got the gunslinger class for Pathfinder First Edition. Um, and in that case, that at least makes sense in that place. Why there isn't that political strife? There's no guild saying we're the number one because there are no guilds like that. There are no magic traditions in your nation. And there was a I think it was Pathfinder First Edition. Yeah, I believe it was. It was an alternative third-party class, the Technologist. I think it came out of EN World. I've got a copy of it kicking around, and it is about technology that isn't magic, but uses kind of the alchemist artificer vibe to produce technological equivalents to spells that they aren't magic. So they will function in a non-magic zone, but still produce these fantastical, steampunk H.G. Wells kind of vibes, Edgar Burroughs kind of thing. Edgar R. Burroughs kind of Burroughs. Regardless, John Carpenter of Mars, Tarzan, all the weird, wacky world kind of thing. Flash Gordon, even though it isn't magic, it's still magical. It's not real world stuff, but it still would function in a magic free zone. And something like that could exist in a country that doesn't have a magical aura of its own. So yeah, in that case, that country makes sense if it doesn't have any magical traditions. But it's also not going to have a church saying our magical tradition is better than everybody else's. So yeah, do you think that in a classic high fantasy setting, the 3.5, whether it's Pathfinder, 5th edition, Pathfinder 2nd edition, or what have you, a high fantasy setting, that a nation can decide that one magical tradition is the only one that can be practiced within its borders, do you think that nation has a chance in hell of surviving against other nations that allow everything to be used because they believe in having that diversity and that flexibility and that variety at their disposal?